Autumn of 1882 settled over Greystone Manor the way it always did, slowly and with great certainty, like a wise elder taking his seat at the head of a long table. The oak trees that lined the wide carriage path turned from green to gold to a deep and burning amber, their leaves falling in slow circles onto the grounds that the Greystone family had kept and tended for nearly 180 years. The manor walls, thick and gray and proud, caught the pale morning light and held it close, and the whole estate in those early October hours had the appearance of something that had been standing long before any living person arrived, and intended to go on standing long after they had gone. Stable hands in heavy wool jackets led the horses out before sunrise. Kitchen maids carried buckets of coal up from the stores below. The smell of wood smoke and damp earth drifted through every corridor of the house, and from the kitchen came the warm and generous smell of Mrs. Beeton's oat porridge bubbling on the iron range, thick with cream and sweetened with a spoonful of dark treacle. It was into this world that Clara Rose Weston had married 6 years before, in the long warm summer of 1876, when she became the Duchess of Greystone and took the hand of Thomas Henry Greystone, the fourth Duke, a man of broad acres, steady character, and a loyalty so deep and quiet that most people who did not know him well mistook it for coldness. Their wedding had been celebrated across 2 counties. The church at Milford Village was filled beyond its last pew, and the wedding breakfast that followed at the manor was spoken of for years by everyone who attended it. There had been roasted goose and saddle of mutton, a great glazed ham, dishes of buttered turnips and roasted parsnips, a syllabub in a deep glass bowl, and a fruit cake soaked in brandy and dressed in white sugar icing that the cook, a broad and capable woman named Nell, had worked on for the better part of a fortnight. Clara herself had not come from great titles or broad lands. She was born the second child of Arthur Weston of Weston Farm in Shropshire, a decent and hardworking man who kept good cattle and paid his bills on time and was respected in his parish without ever being celebrated beyond it. Clara's mother, Ruth Weston, had raised 4 children with a practical hand and a warm heart, and had told Clara from a young age that a woman's greatest possession was not her looks or her dowry but her word, and that once a person's word was gone there was very little left worth counting. Clara had grown up tall and composed, with brown hair and calm blue eyes, and a manner of listening to people that made them feel, sometimes uncomfortably, that she was hearing more than they were saying. She had been 20 years old when she married Thomas. He had been 29. Thomas Greystone was, in the way of most dukes of his era, a man of few public words and many private ones. He managed his estate with care, treated his tenants with fairness, kept horses he loved and dogs that followed him everywhere, and sat through long formal dinners with the patient endurance of a man who would much rather be reading. What those who did not know him well could not see, and what Clara had come to know the way you come to know a piece of land you walk every day, was that he was a man of extraordinary gentleness beneath the formality. He brought her the first blackberries of the season every August, picked himself from the hedge at the far end of the east field. He always noticed when she was tired before she said so. On cold evenings, he set her chair closer to the fire when she was not looking so that by the time she sat down it was already warm. They had lost a child in 1879, a grief they had carried together in a silence that was not emptiness, but rather the particular fullness of 2 people holding something very heavy side by side. After that they were, if anything, quieter with each other and more tender. The Weston family in Shropshire had not prospered in the years since Clara's marriage. Her father Arthur had passed in 1880 after a short illness, leaving the farm with debts that had not been visible while he was alive and managing things. What he left behind was a house that needed work, land that had not been properly maintained in its last 2 seasons, and 3 adult children with unequal shares of their father's stubbornness and none of his industry. Clara's elder brother George had taken over the farm and immediately demonstrated that his true talent lay in explaining why things could not be done rather than doing them. Her younger sister Martha had married a man named Robert Sloane, who worked as a clerk for a wool merchant in Shrewsbury, and who had opinions about money that were large in proportion to the amount of it he actually possessed. Her youngest brother Samuel was 17 when their father died, and had since grown into a young man of 20 who was charming in the way that costs nothing and useful in the way that amounts to very little. George had written to Thomas in the spring of 1881, asking for a loan to repair the farm's stone wall and reseed the lower field. Thomas had sent the money without condition and without lecture, because the lower field was good land and the wall needed doing, and he was not a man who attached suffering to generosity. Clara had written to George herself, a warm letter, and had hoped the gesture would set a tone for something better between her married life and her family in Shropshire. What it set a tone for was something else. George came to visit that July, arriving in a hired coach with Martha and Robert and Samuel all bundled in alongside him, the four of them descending on Greystone Manor with the ease of people who have decided that an invitation to visit is essentially the same as an invitation to stay. Thomas received them with good grace. Mrs. Beaton prepared a dinner of roast beef and Yorkshire pudding with gravy, boiled potatoes, a dish of stewed plums, and a seed cake that was dense and buttery, and disappeared within the first evening. Clara sat at the table and watched her family eat and talk and settle themselves into the manor's best chairs, and she felt something she did not immediately have a name for, something careful and watchful that sat just below the warmth she wanted to feel. The visit extended itself with the naturalness of water finding a level. 2 weeks became 3. 3 became 5. George spent his days walking the Greystone grounds with his hands in his pockets and his eyes moving over the land in a way that Clara recognized, because it was the same way people looked at things they were trying to calculate. Samuel borrowed one of the horses without asking and rode it for 3 hours on a day. The animal had already been worked and came back with a cheerful unawareness of having done anything worth mentioning. Robert spent a great deal of time in the library and asked Thomas one evening over the port about the possibility of investing in a land development scheme near Liverpool, a scheme that Thomas's solicitor, a thorough and careful man named Mr. Oliver Crane of Shrewsbury, later determined, had no legal registration and no verifiable principles behind it. Martha was the subtlest of the four, and therefore the most worth watching. She was pleasant at every meal and helpful in the small visible ways that draw attention to themselves, carrying a dish here or complimenting the curtains there, and she asked Clara questions about the running of the household with an interest that Clara had at first taken for sisterly curiosity. It was only later, after the visit had finally ended and Mr. Crane's letter arrived, that Clara understood those questions for what they were. The letter came in September, 2 weeks after the Westons had returned to Shropshire. Mr. Crane wrote with the measured precision of a man who took no pleasure in delivering difficult news, but considered it his professional obligation to do so without delay. He had been contacted by a linen draper in Milford named Mr. Hobbs, and separately by a grocer on the High Street named Mrs. Farrow, and by a seamstress named Agnes Tilly who worked from a shop near the church. All three had extended credit on the basis of orders, placed in Clara's name, by a woman who had identified herself as acting on behalf of the Duchess of Greystone in the matter of household purchases. The woman had been Martha Sloane. The goods collected included 2 lengths of fine linen, a case of preserved fruits, 3 bottles of rosewater, and enough silk ribbon to trim a dozen bonnets. None of it had been for Clara. None of the accounts had been settled. Mrs. Farrow, who had known Clara since before her marriage, had waited 6 weeks before going to Mr. Crane because she had not wanted to cause trouble and had assumed there was some confusion that would resolve itself. Agnes Tilly had waited because she was afraid. Clara read the letter at her writing desk in the morning room. She read it twice. Then she sat for a long while looking out at the kitchen garden where the last of the autumn cabbages were standing in their rows, round and gray-green in the flat morning light, and she thought about Agnes Tilly being afraid. She thought about Mrs. Farrow not wanting to cause trouble. She thought about the word her mother had told her was a woman's greatest possession. Then she folded the letter and went to find Thomas. He read it standing at his desk in the study, one hand flat on the desktop. She watched his face the way she always watched his face, because Thomas's face was a landscape she had learned to read, and the changes in it, though small, told her everything. Something moved behind his eyes, quiet and final, the way the sky changes before a storm that is still 2 hours away. He set the letter down. He looked at her. She looked at him. Between them passed the kind of conversation that belongs only to people who have lived closely enough together to have stopped needing all the words. They sent word to Shropshire that the family was invited to luncheon at the manor on the following Thursday. Thomas's instructions to Mrs. Beaton were for the meal to be served in the formal dining room. Mrs. Beaton, who had kept this house for 16 years and understood everything that happened in it, set the table for 6 without any comment beyond asking whether the good china was wanted, and was told that it was. The Westons arrived at midday. George came through the door first, hat in hand, with the expression of a man who is confident he can talk his way through whatever is waiting for him. Samuel was behind him, wearing a new waistcoat that had not been part of his wardrobe during the summer visit. Martha and Robert came last, Martha with a careful smile already arranged, and Robert with the slightly glazed look of a man who has been rehearsing arguments since Tuesday. They sat. Mrs. Beaton brought in cold roast chicken, a dish of pickled walnuts, brown bread, a wedge of hard cheese, and a pot of strong black tea. She poured and she withdrew, and the door clicked shut behind her, and the room settled into a silence that even Samuel did not try to fill. Thomas sat at the head of the table. Clara sat at his right. She had dressed that morning in her dark blue serge dress with the high neck and the plain cuffs, her hair pinned simply, no ornamentation except her wedding ring and a small brooch of her mother's at her collar. She had looked at herself in the glass before coming downstairs and had thought that she looked exactly like what she was, which was enough. Thomas told them what Mr. Crane had found. He spoke without raising his voice, without cruelty, without the pleasure that a smaller man might have taken in the telling. He named the 3 tradespeople. He described what had been taken. He told them that he had settled all 3 accounts that morning through Mr. Crane, because the people of Milford had done nothing wrong and would not be made to suffer for what had been done in his wife's name. He said this last thing with a particular quietness that was somehow louder than volume would have been. George began to speak almost before Thomas had finished. His tone moved through several registers quickly, starting with surprise and passing through explanation and arriving at grievance with a speed that told Clara the route was well traveled. He said that Martha had meant no real harm. He said the amounts were small. He said that Clara's position made such things less significant than they would be to ordinary people. He said, and this was the moment Clara felt something in herself go very still, that family had to look after family, and that Clara of all people ought to understand that. He did not say he was sorry. He explained, which is a different thing entirely and has always been so. Martha's eyes filled with tears that stayed exactly at the brim without falling, which was a thing their mother had never taught either of them, and which Martha must have learned on her own. Robert looked at the cheese. Samuel looked at the window. Thomas let George finish and then waited a moment longer, and the silence after the waiting had a quality to it that made George stop as though he had walked into something solid. Then Thomas turned and looked at Clara, and in his eyes was everything she needed, not instruction, not rescue, simply the steady and unambiguous fact of him being there. Clara rose from her chair. Thomas rose with her at once, the way he always did, and he stood beside her, and he was quiet because this was hers. She looked at her brother and her sister, and the men they had brought with them, and she took them in with the full and unhurried attention she had always given the things that mattered to her. She saw George clearly, perhaps for the first time without the blur of childhood love softening the edges, and she saw a man who had turned his sister's good fortune into a grievance against his own life, and then used that grievance to justify whatever he needed to take. She saw Martha, and understood that her sister had chosen smallness, had chosen to fold herself around a man of limited means and limited honor rather than stand in her own life and make something of it. She saw Robert as exactly what he was, a man who attached himself to other people's ceilings and called it a home. She saw Samuel, young enough still to become something better if someone stopped indulging him long enough to let him try. She did not say any of this. She was the Duchess of Greystone. This was her house. Her mother's brooch was at her collar, and her husband was at her side, and she had not come this far or built this life to perform her feelings for an audience. She said, in a voice that was entirely level and entirely clear, "I have loved all of you as a sister should. I have never once counted the cost of that love, because I did not believe it needed counting. I understand now that I was the only one in this family who felt that way. You used my name as though it were a coin you had found on the street, something to spend without wondering who had earned it. I will not pretend that does not matter because it matters very much. She paused and the room was still. You may leave my property now. No anger in it, no tears, no hesitation of any kind. Just a woman standing in the house she had made her own, beside the man who had stood beside her through every quiet and difficult thing, saying the only words left to say and meaning all of them. George stood, his chair scraped back and he straightened his coat. He looked at Thomas once more, but Thomas was looking at Clara, and the look on his face was one that George would not find any purchase in, so he looked away. Martha rose without the tears falling, which meant they had always been a performance. Robert stood and took his hat from the table. Samuel stood last, and Clara saw in his young face something that was not quite shame, but was at least the shape of it, which she supposed was a beginning. Mrs. Beaton was in the corridor. The bags were brought down from the guest rooms. The hired coach was sent for. While they waited, there was nothing said that needed to be remembered. When the coach rolled away down the gravel path and the sound of the wheels faded through the oak trees, Clara stood at the window of the morning room and watched it go until it was gone. Thomas stood beside her. After a time, he rested his hand over hers on the windowsill, and she turned her hand and held his, and they stood together in the quiet of the house that was theirs. While outside, the oak trees went on in the October wind, and the kitchen chimneys sent their smoke up into the gray afternoon sky, and Greystone Manor stood as it had always stood, unchanged and unhurried and entirely itself. Mr. Hobbs the linen draper, when Thomas called on him the following market day, shook the Duke's hand and said he was sorry to have caused any bother. Thomas told him that no bother had been caused by him and that his patience had been a credit to him. Clara, standing at Thomas's side on the pavement outside the shop, thanked Mr. Hobbs by name and meant it. He had known her since before her title, and he would know her after it, and that was worth more than ceremony. Agnes Tilley, the seamstress, received a note from Clara that week written in Clara's own hand, thanking her and telling her that her custom would always be welcome at Greystone. It was a small thing. Clara sent it anyway. The autumn deepened. The fires were lit at 4 o'clock now, and the evenings closed in early over the manor. Mrs. Beaton made the great suet puddings that were particular to the Greystone kitchen, steamed in their basins and turned out onto white plates and eaten with thick yellow custard. The dogs slept by the fire. The horses were rugged against the cold. Thomas read aloud in the evenings from whatever was on the side table, and Clara sat beside him and listened, and outside the old walls the wind came down from the hills and moved through the bare oak trees, and the night settled over everything softly, like a hand laid in blessing on a bowed head. She heard from George once more the following spring. A letter, short, asking whether Thomas might put in a word with someone in the matter of a tenancy. She wrote back in one paragraph, honest and neither warm nor cold, and sealed it and sent it and did not carry it with her after that. Some doors when they close cleanly. That is not cruelty. That is simply what a well-built door does. Now the candle is low and the story has been told, and before the fire goes out entirely, there is something to be asked of you who have sat with it. Because a story like this one, of a woman standing in her own home and naming what was done to her and choosing her own quiet dignity over the noise of confrontation, is not only a story from 1882. It lives in every era. So tell us truly, how did this story sit with you? Did Clara do the right thing, or was there a part of you that wished she had said more, or perhaps less? Did you feel the weight of what Thomas gave her simply by standing there without a word? And have you ever had a moment of your own, a room, a table, a doorway, where you had to decide whether to keep a door open that had cost you too much already, or finally, quietly, let it close? We would love to know what you felt and what you think. This story belongs to all of us now.